As I said this morning, this is actually our 7th conference. It's called Mysteries of Sky 5, Mysteries of Space and Sky 5, but it's actually the 7th one. And you know, we've had a lot of speakers over the years, and I have to say, in all candor, that our next speaker is probably the most popular speaker. The most popular speaker. And I've said it before, and I have to say it again, and I know some of you have heard her before, but those of you that have heard her before always say to me, well, if you ever have another conference, you have to bring her back. You have to bring her back. I said, okay, we'll bring her back. And I've also said this before, but I'll say it again. You know, when I talk to people, for example, my students, a number of my students are here, and in my first class I tell my students about some of the work I do and some of the research I do. And when I say that I've been interested in UFOs and I have UFO conferences, and when I say that I work with people who have been abducted by aliens, you know, the eyebrows go up, the eyes go up, and the giggles and laughs and all the rest of that. And you know, after a while, I don't think about it. But I get that reaction simply by saying that I've done research in that area. Imagine the courage of somebody who can go before a group like this and say, not so much research, but I've actually been there. I've actually had this experience myself. Now that takes guts. Trust me, that takes guts. That takes courage, because I'll tell you, I've worked with, if you will, abductees who understandably will not come forward and do what she has done. And what she has done repeatedly, driving from Virginia to come here for these conferences. I've said this before, in a sense, this is a speaker who really doesn't want to be here because he's not happy about what she's done, but what's happened to her. But she does have a wonderful book, and I've said this before too, and I'll say it again. If you're interested at all in the abduction phenomenon, this is really the book to get. This is co-authored by Anna and Beth Collings. It describes her accounts. It is really interesting. One of these books that you can't put it down. Connections Solving Our Alien Abduction Mystery. So we are really delighted once again to have this very, very gutsy lady, Anna Jamerson.
Thank you for all of you who've been here before and heard me speak, and your kind words to Peter. Oh no, it never gets easier. What button do I push? There we go. I got it. Yes, as Peter said, I am an abductee. And as Don said, he's been exploring UFOs for 56 years. Well, I can say that I have memories, sketchy at times, of over 56 years of abductions. And I'm not as old as Don, yet. But for those of you who are new, who may not know what abductions are, there is sort of a typical scenario, although it's not really very typical once you get into it. But a typical abduction is pale, skinny, gray guys with huge eyes come to my bedroom in the middle of the night, wake me up, float me out of bed through a closed window into a craft that's hovering somewhere outside my bedroom window. After I'm taken aboard the ship, I may be taken to a place where some sort of medical exam or some sort of puncturing of the body takes place. After that, I may go on a tour of the ship. I may end up in what we call lecture halls, where I meet hundreds or sometimes thousands of other abductees at the same time, where we're all sort of getting the same message. After that, I'm returned home, put in my bed, with my memories wiped out. Like I say, that's a typical abduction scenario, and one of the first people that sort of came to those conclusions after studying hundreds of abductees is your next speaker, Dave Jacobs. And without researchers to put all this in context, I have a very hard time looking at my own abduction experiences and say, is this real? I know it's true, but I don't know if it's real sometimes. And sometimes the only way we can get some validity is to look at research, to look at what the researchers have come up with and say, these are the same patterns that I've been seeing in my abductions. So what I'd like to do for you today is take you on a journey, a similar journey to what I started in 1992. I was lucky. For the first 56 years of my life, I had no idea I was an abductee. I knew I had strange things in my past that, you know, sometimes electricity worked kind of funny. The mix master in my house would sometimes work, sometimes wouldn't. I just put it away, and next time it would sort of work. I figured that's what electricity did. Sometimes you turn on a light switch, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You don't have to get it fixed, but because when I drive by in my car on roads, like superhighways, you have these great big huge lights. As I drive by, the lights go out. As I leave, the lights come back on. Sometimes when I walk by street lights, in fact, when I was in Michigan, a few of us were together and we walked by street lights and they go off. And we continue walking and they come back on. I didn't think that was strange when I was growing up. I didn't know any better. You know, I was a kid. I never did get enough sleep when I was a teenager. I was always tired. During the week, I'd get 10, 12 hours of sleep a night, and then on weekends, I'd have to catch up. It was just terrible. My sleep patterns were so disrupted that I'd wake up in the morning, my feet would be on the pillow. Sometimes my nightgown would be on backwards. But I just figured, I was so tired I didn't know what I was doing. Time also was very variable for me. Sometimes a trip to the grocery store would take hours. Sometimes I'd be going someplace and end up there 2 hours before I thought I should get there. I just figured I didn't know how to tell time very well. It wasn't until 1992 that I realized that what I considered normal was probably not normal for a lot of other people. And in 1992, it started with Beth Collings. I run a horse farm where I breed Trakehner horses. I also have a boarding stable where people pay me to take care of their horses. Well, I just fired my second manager of the year because I didn't like the way they were taking care of the horses. I work full-time for the government. Not the CIA or anybody like that, but I used to work for the Forest Service and the Park Service for a while. So I had a government job, which is pretty normal here in Washington. But I had to have somebody take care of the horses while I was at work. I just fired my second barn manager. I put an ad in the paper, and Beth answered it. When we met, it was like we'd known each other forever, and we figured we'd met someplace in the horse world. Well, she had just moved down from Boston. About a week before, she had been driving to work, and all of a sudden she decided she had to leave. She drove into work, turned in a resignation, turned around, went home, packed all her gear in a U-Haul, and moved to Virginia. It just happened. I ran the ad. The next week she was working for me at the farm. Things were pretty okay. Things were working well until a few years later. Whoops. Well, anyway, you can look at that while I explain what was going on. In 1991, December 15th, Beth went to visit her parents, which she did. We lived a couple hours away in Virginia. When she was coming back, she usually got home around 10 o'clock or so. Well, she didn't get home till about midnight because as she was coming back, she had to pull off the side of the road because she saw these really bright lights. She thought a plane was going to crash, so she stopped to help. The next thing she remembered, she was coming around the corner about 60 miles an hour, about 2 miles from the farm. She had to stop the car and throw up. She came home and we figured maybe it was stress. So I stayed home from work for a couple weeks and we sorted things out. And on January 2nd. She went out to visit friends after holiday parties, was driving home, and again, bright lights, except this time she remembered something. She got home a couple hours late, her ears were bleeding, her earrings were in backwards, but she remembered this. She remembered the farm truck in a white space, a gray space, with sort of even lighting. She remembered, found these little tiny beings that were around her, and that was about it. Also, I'd like to say something. All these pictures here that you will see, all the drawings, they're done by Beth. She's the artist of the two of us. I write. She writes pretty well too, but she draws and I don't. I knew after, or we both knew after she had drawn these pictures and remembered these things, that something very strange was going on. She was missing time. She was seeing bright lights. She was sick to her stomach. It was pretty disturbing. And when we started talking about it, we remembered a couple years earlier, and this is one of Rob's DLs, those funny darn lights. We saw lights over the barn in 1987. And they weren't just the lights there in the sky. They zipped over the house, they zipped back, they went over the orchard. They did very strange things. Beth, my sister, and I saw these lights at night, except we could never agree with how many lights there were. Were there 3, 5, 6, 8? We didn't agree with what they did, except they moved very, very fast. And once we saw them that night, I went back to watching television. Beth went to bed. My sister went back to reading a book. We never talked about it. But we knew at the time that these were UFOs. We knew it was something very, very strange. So when Beth had these creatures and had memories of stuff like that, we started putting all this together. And I knew it had something to do with UFOs, so did she. Except we didn't know where to get help. We didn't know anything about this. We hadn't read any books on it, hadn't seen much in the newspaper. So I looked up UFO in the phone book. Yeah, pretty dumb thing to do. But I happened to live in Washington, and I found the Fund for UFO Research. And that I made that call and ended up talking to Don Berliner. I'd asked Don at that time, I said, is it possible for somebody to get kidnapped by a UFO? And of course I expected him to say, nope, never happened. Unfortunately, he said, yeah, we've heard of that before. Wasn't the answer either one of us wanted. So after a few days, I finally convinced Anna, no, that's me, Beth, obviously you figured out we're using pseudonyms. That's to protect our families and to protect our friends. And we don't want them ridiculed. We don't want to be ridiculed. We want to be able to have a normal life, so we've done this under pseudonyms. But after talking with Don, he and Rob decided that they would come to the farm and interview us and find out what was going on. But before they got there, Beth kept making drawings. And she drew this guy. She calls him the Cat Man. But she didn't know what he did. She just had this memory of this person, this thing. Well, Don and Rob showed up at the farm. Our 1-hour interview turned into 3 hours. I had called them to get help for Beth. I was going to be an investigator once I found out that there were people investigating these things. I had my own abductee in the house, so I was way ahead of those guys. I could figure it out, and we could solve the problem and figure out what was going on. Little did I know that wasn't to happen. And one of the things we talked about at the time was abductions. You know, how often did they happen? Were a lot of people involved? You know, what was going on here? Where did these creatures come from? Who was doing it? Who knew about it? But Don and Rob wouldn't tell us anything. And I learned later they wouldn't tell us anything because they were afraid of contaminating Beth's memories. They didn't want to tell us all that stuff. In fact, they asked us not to read any books and not to read anything on the subject before we explored our own memories and tried to figure out what was going on ourselves, so we wouldn't be contaminated by what other people thought. And one of the questions that I was hoping they would answer differently than they did was, once you've been abducted, does that mean that's it? Never happen again? You know, it'd be a nice story to tell your grandchildren. Unfortunately, they answered that one, said, no, it's not usually a one-time thing. So we were in for a roller coaster ride. During the interview, when they were there, we were talking, they'd ask us if we'd read any books, and we said no, but Beth remembered we'd had a book a couple years before, and it was this book. Except neither one of us could read the book. The face on the cover was so frightening that we took the book out to the burn barrel, dropped it in the flames, and forgot about it. Now, at the time, we didn't think anything strange about it, but Don and Rob, they were getting an inkling that there was something really strange going on. During the next month or so, since Beth was the abductee and I was a researcher, I read everything on UFOs I could get my hands on. I read about sighting reports and tons of sighting reports. I started reading abduction stories as well. Started with Bud Hopkins' Missing Time, and that was a little scary. And it was, when I got to Intruders, I had a very, very hard time reading that book. In fact, I couldn't finish it for several months. And all the same time that I was doing all this research and getting things happening, Beth was continuing to have experiences. She was continuing to remember things. And one of the things she remembered was from way, way back when her son was quite young. And her son would wake up in the night and be scared by the cats in the window. And that's what they called them. And that's what Beth and her son talked about, were the cats in the window. And she drew this picture. And it wasn't for a while after this that Beth realized this was a second-story window. Talented cats. She also drew this guy, which looks similar to Catman, which we saw earlier. But this guy is called Doc. And Beth remembered that whenever she had an abduction experience, Doc was there. He's about 5'6", and he's tall, skinny. As we know now, he's very typical of the gray aliens that other people have drawn. But she also remembered seeing this hand on her shoulder. And when Doc put his hand on her shoulder or her forehead, it was during medical procedures or other procedures that were painful, and he was able to take away pain. You notice his hand has 4 fingers, not 5. They have no opposable thumb as we do, but they can grasp anything they want because these fingers are prehensile. They ring around things like a monkey's tail. There don't seem to be individual joints like we have in our fingers. And also, if you notice, the tips are also not like our fingers. There's no fingernails, but they're little suction pads. I haven't a clue what they're for. Sorry about that. I'm just an abductee.
I know my imagination ran wild.
These guys, Beth called the escort service. They're shorter. They're about 4.5 feet tall. They don't have clothes on, but you know, there's nothing there to distinguish whether they're male, female, or anything else. These guys would always come to abduct Beth. It takes at least 2 of these for an abduction because it takes 1 on each side to float through a window. There's something about them and the number of them that to get us from our bedrooms or from the barn or from the back field or from our cars, they have to escort us. And that's why she called them the escort service. So we were pretty obsessed with this. She was having experiences and making drawings. I would come home and find her curled up on the kitchen floor, sobbing, terrified, because she was remembering an abduction. And unfortunately, when you remember an abduction, you don't just remember it like, I remember we had lunch earlier today. She relives it. She was terrified. It wasn't a fun thing to go through for her or me, because there was nothing I could do to comfort her. Nothing I could do till the memory stopped. Well, as we were talking, we got to talking one afternoon about some childhood games that she had remembered. We were sitting in the living room, and she remembered that early, when she was like 8 or 9, she would always be paired up with this other little blonde girl that was quite a bit younger than her, 3 or 4 years younger than she was. And one of the games she remembered was this. It's called Stick in the Wall. And what would happen is the stick would move in the wall, a gray stick. And she said that what they were supposed to do is move the stick through the wall and make patterns and make it move around to develop their mental capabilities to move things. Well, this other little girl wasn't willing to do that. She had to grab hold of the stick and make it move up and down the wall. So Beth was catching her so she wouldn't fall underneath. She always had to protect this other little girl. There was another game that she mentioned at that time, and that was the magic box. And I'm going to pose the same question to you as she did to me that day. And it's a magic box. It's a cube. It's a gray. Of course, everything's gray. It's about this big. But if you were given a magic box by very strange creatures and told to do something with it, what would you do with it? What's its purpose? Yes, speak up.
Most people would open it.
You can open it. Other things? Shake it. You can toss it against the wall. You can sit on it. Do all kinds of things with a box. Hide it. My immediate reaction was, oh, you're supposed to take the magic box, turn it inside out with your mind, and it gets smaller. Yeah, shocked me too. But that was exactly the answer that Beth had been given by the aliens. You think at this point I was thinking maybe I was involved a little bit more than I thought? Yeah, I was beginning to get an inkling of what was going on. There were other childhood games that she also mentioned that day, and one was a fire stick. And the fire stick was a stick about this long that floated in the air, and again, she had to move it with her mind, and she had to throw the stick. But when she threw the stick forward with her mind, it ended up behind her. If she threw it sideways, it ended up over here, coming this way. And it was called a fire stick because every time it touched her, it burned and left a burn mark. So she got real adept at making sure it didn't touch her. And the game ended when she learned to throw it at the alien that was standing in the corner watching her. Yeah. Another was a hamster cage. You know, those hamster wheels, that they have, and the little hamsters crawl around and stuff. That was another game that she was given to do. But it wasn't to make the wheel turn. She was to sit in the middle of the cage and levitate up. The cage was somehow to protect her from going too far, I guess. Never did quite figure out that one. One time in about 1960, Beth had remembered being at a family reunion in Maryland. And she left her friends at the picnic area where they were and went off to a picnic table that was farther away from her parents and her friends and other people, and she had gone to meet her friend. Well, her friend showed up, her little blonde friend again, but, Coincidentally, yeah. But she didn't think it was the same blonde friend because this girl had a British Cockney accent and she was also wearing a blue uniform. Now, when Beth mentioned that, she also said there was an emblem in the pocket of the uniform. And I said, Beth, wait a minute. Hold that thought. Draw that emblem. So she took some paper and started drawing. I went upstairs, and I came down with my blue school uniform jacket with a purple emblem on the pocket that matched the drawing she had just made. Uh-oh. Yeah. Beth didn't know I'd lived in England from 1959 to 1961. She didn't know I'd gone to British schools, and that when I came back, they thought I was a British kid because I had a Cockney accent. Well, after this fortuitous meeting, the two little girls walked off into the woods where they were met by the escort service and led up to a waiting ship. That was the incident that convinced me that I was just as much an abductee as she was. And then I started trying to explore my own memories. One of the ones that I ended up remembering was the albino girl, is what Beth calls her. I call it the babysitter. This was a creature that was always in one of the corners. Well, there's no corners in these rooms. They're all sort of round rooms. But this creature was always there whenever us two little girls were together watching us. From what I know now, this looks like one of the hybrids. About this time, which was about April of '92, we had met with Dick Hall, we had met a couple other researchers, we had met Rob and Sue again, and had gotten relatively comfortable talking to them about our experiences. And at that time, Richard Hall invited us to go to the conference at MIT on abductions. Well, neither one of us wanted to go, really, because we were afraid we'd end up with 100 weirdos, and we didn't want to hang out with weirdos. Because we weren't weirdos, we're normal people that had funny things happen to us. In fact, things that we really wished hadn't had happened to us. We were embarrassed by it. We didn't want anybody to know about it. It wasn't something, you run out and tell everybody about. Not that sort of thing. During that time, I had wanted to get more memories back. I wasn't getting as many memories as I wanted. And I'd heard about hypnosis. I set up an appointment with a psychologist that did hypnosis. Unfortunately, I canceled about 4 of those appointments because I wanted to know, but I didn't want to know. It's a Pandora's box that once you open, you can't stuff it back in again. Once, somebody came out and delved into my memories, and the memories came out of me doing something I'd never read about. Nobody else I ever knew had experienced, but they were my memories. It was very hard to deny that I was an abductee. And at that time, I really wanted to deny it. I didn't want to be a member of this exclusive club. Eventually, I did find a hypnotist that would, and I kept the appointment. Unfortunately, the hypnotist was experienced she dealt with multiple personality disorder and abused children. And she was convinced that that's what was going on with me, that I was remembering abuse from my past. When she hypnotized me, and immediately I went to an exam room with big gray eyes, staring at me in big funny lights and the whole typical abduction scenario. After she got me calmed down, because I was screaming at the time, it wasn't very pleasant. And she said, sorry, you're going to have to find somebody else to help you. I really don't want to deal with this. I really don't. I'm too old for this. I want to retire. I don't want to know anything about this. So it wasn't just me that didn't want to know anything about this. It was also therapists. And I'm really glad there are some therapists around that will deal with it and help us through it. Because if we were alone dealing with this stuff, we wouldn't make it. I mean, Beth and I were very glad we had each other because we needed each other, but we were also very glad for the researchers. We needed outside people to keep us sane. But anyway, we ended up at MIT at the conference there, and we met Bud Hopkins there. And at that conference, we were on a panel of abductees, and we got to talk with a few other people, and so we didn't feel quite so strange. And one of the questions Bud asked the panel was if anybody had had imaginary friends when they were growing up. Well, Beth raised her hand. And she said, I didn't have an imaginary friend, but I did have an imaginary dog that I used to go into the woods with, and we used to play, and it was my friend, and you know, all this stuff. And Bud said, well, what color was the dog? Gray. How big was he? About 4 feet tall. So, you know, even what we thought was real, you know, you kind of wonder what's real and what isn't. Anyway, so eventually we decided that we would work with Bud Hopkins because Bud was a very respected researcher, and we'd read some of his books and looked at his technique, and we felt safe with him. So Beth and I went up to New York and worked with Bud, and we explored a time we thought something might have happened, but we weren't quite sure. So we were separated, and Bud hypnotized Beth, went back to this area where she had had an abduction. I came downstairs after he'd finished that one, and she listened in on my hypnosis session. And Bud hypnotized me, and we told almost exactly the same story. And the story we told started with us seeing a bright light one evening outside the farm, and all of a sudden running outside to the orchard, looking up and seeing this wonderful UFO with these lights going on around and around, and saying, look, we got to follow that. We've never seen one before. This is our last chance. We'll never see it again. Let's follow it and see what happens. So we followed it, and we ended up here. We ended up in what seemed like a tunnel. It seemed to have small, narrow gauge tracks in the ground, and there was an odd green light in the hallway. And when we got to the end of the tunnel, we found this, the UFO that we'd been chasing. But what we also found was probably 200-300 people. My old college roommate was there. My current veterinarian was there. Beth met some people that she had known, you know, years and years ago. There was a guy there that I knew from work. He was not my supervisor, but one of the other supervisors in the area I worked. And unfortunately, some of those people were cowering in the corners. Some were zombie-like. Others of us, you know, were sitting there talking to each other. I talked to my roommate, you know, from college, because we hadn't seen each other in 20 years. And it was very, very strange that we would meet all these people, and around the edges of the room were grays, sort of keeping watch on us. We don't know why we were there, what was happening. But we were let off in separate groups. Beth went in one group, I went in another, and I remember being dropped off in the backfield and having to walk up to the house in my nightgown, in the cold, with bare feet. And the next morning, there were leaves and twigs in my bed, and my feet were very, very sore. But with this craft, it brought memories of these other craft that Beth had seen. The sand dollar is the one you just saw that was in the hangar. The cigar-shaped craft, many people have reported. I don't know how long these things are. There's some I estimate to be at least a mile long, and others I would swear are at least 5 miles long on the inside. But who am I to judge distances? I don't know how long they are. I just know they're huge. The hat was an interesting one, but I don't know where that one came from. The flying egg seems to be a more typical shape that people have seen. The box was almost square, but very, very large, and colored lights all around the edges of the box, just running round and round, round and round. What I don't understand is a lot of these craft are so well lighted. They're bright. They're like, you know, circuses. And they want people to see them. How come everybody in the world hasn't seen one? Or do they only light it up for abductees? I don't know. The boomerang on the left is very similar to what was seen in Phoenix, with the Phoenix lights several years ago, and also in the 90s over Belgium. They had a lot of sightings of boomerangs. Now you got to remember, Beth didn't read any of these books I did. She didn't want to read anything about it. So her memories are a lot less contaminated than mine might be from things I had read. But I know for a fact she'd never read about a lot of these things. This claw guy, it was like a flange on the bottom of it. And that was one I told Beth about because I saw it one afternoon in Alabama where my car had mysteriously stopped alongside a road. And then this gray creature was knocking on my window and saying, "Come with me." Of course, it's all done telepathically. They don't have any mouths to move. You don't see any of that happening. But you know you're supposed to follow them. You know you're supposed to go with them. That was not a very pleasant abduction. But that just happened to be the shape of the one that was there. Beth and I have encountered several different species, if you will, and strange creatures in our travels. This is one that I saw. We call them Spock ears. He seemed to be reptilian. Those are scales. He was greenish in color, but his ears were actually furry. Not feathers. It was fur. It could be feathers, who knows? If they're finding that dinosaurs possibly had feathers. I don't know. A lot of the literature I had read talks about reptilian guys, and many abductees have reported being raped by them. I don't have memories of that with this guy. The only memory I have of him is sitting at some sort of console, moving his claw-like hands, over something. I don't know what he was doing, but he didn't seem to be a threat to me. This guy seems a lot more threatening. The person he was working on was, again, sort of zombie-like. He was out. The Greys have a way of controlling us that we cannot move unless they allow us to. And I guess that's what was happening with this man. The claws on this guy, I don't know how he can operate. I don't know how he can touch a person and not leave very, very strange marks. Beth saw this creature. I've never seen one. I don't want to see one. He seems very improbable in that he's got a carapace like an insect on the outside, and his joints are all external. And sometimes, well, many times, we wonder, which of our memories are true? Which are real? Or are we making it up? Sometimes we have no way of telling. And the only way sometimes is to talk to researchers and have them confirm to us that we're not the only ones that are seeing these guys. I'm the only person that's seen this one. Called the Pink Lady because she was very small, very pink. Her ear reminds me a lot of Ferengis from The Next Generation, Star Trek. Maybe I made this one up. But she's the one that seemed very wise. I met her in a place I would only describe as a library, if aliens can have libraries. She gave me warnings about earth changes, about massive earth changes, how things were going to change. In 1995, when I had this memory of her, there were a lot of people and a lot of prophesiers that were saying, the coast of California is going away and the center of the continent is splitting open where the Mississippi is and all kinds of stuff. She was telling me very, very similar things. She also gave me what I considered was a thought bomb. And what the thought bomb was, it was something placed in my mind, and it was to go off in February of 1997. It was to give me information I should need because of all these earth changes that were happening, and so that I could survive and protect those next dear to me. Beginning of February 1997, I was a wreck because I didn't know what was there. Both Beth and I had been a wreck for years. In preparation for this talk, I went back and read some of the book, and we were pretty messed up back then. Everything was in chaos. We didn't know what was real. We didn't know how we could deal with it. Luckily, there were some good therapists around as well that could help us, get our heads on straight and start figuring out what was going on and how we could adapt to being abducted and knowing about it, yet get on with our life. Because the majority of our life is still lived here. We had to function. I had to get up and go to work every day. Beth had to get up and take care of the horses. She had to earn her living. I had to earn mine. I mean, the bills didn't stop. But anyway, beginning of February, I waited. The thought bomb went off. And what it showed me was that LA would be hit by a massive earthquake. I saw the buildings of LA just sinking into the ground, like the ground had turned to liquid. And they said that would happen in 2 weeks, the end of February, 1995. Anybody remember that happening? Yeah, I don't either. There was another one she gave me that in August of 1998, there was going to be a huge tsunami that engulfed New York City. And that didn't happen either. I think all those things that the pink lady gave me were part of their psychological testing. The aliens seem to do a lot of that. They put us in improbable situations to try and figure out how we're going to react, what we're going to do about it. They seem to be very, very interested in how we think and how we interact with each other and how we interact with our world. But they lie a lot. So I've gotten to the point that anything they tell me I figure is a lie. It's safer that way. I haven't maxed out any credit cards yet. I'm not going to, ever. Another guys we saw one time when I sort of got loose by myself. And I do want to thank Beth in these drawings. She put clothes on us. When we're on the ship, we don't have any clothes on. They come off when we get on the ship. And then just before we're sent home, we have to dress ourselves. And I think a lot of us, since I have memories of it, we switch clothes to try and trigger memories when we get home. Like I ended up with some other abductee's nightgown. Or I put my nightgown on backwards, so when I woke up the next morning, I'd know something strange had happened, and then try and remember it. It didn't work. Most of the time, none of that stuff worked. But I do have a drawer in my dresser that has other people's underwear, nightgowns, shirts. They're not mine, they're not Beth's. We don't know where they came from, but they're in our house. These guys, we call it clones in the wall. They look very, very human. They all look alike. They seem to be about 7 feet tall. My one reaction when I saw this is, why do they waste all that storage space? Why aren't they in, toe first? Why are they parallel? Who knows? They do seem to be clones, and I think they're clones of this guy. This guy's John, and this is one of the guys that, if you remember Sue's talk earlier, was talking about Emily. Emily had a drawing of a guy that looks almost exactly like this, including the insignia, the patch on the chest, and she drew that before Beth and I ever met her. Like I say, these guys are the security guards. I don't think they're security for us abductees. Beth had her own. John was the one that would always come to see her. The one I had was James. His hair seemed to be lighter, but he looked almost exactly like this. And he was always there to to sit me down and tell me I'd been doing wrong, that I wasn't following the program, that I needed to get with the program because I was messing things up. And when somebody 7 feet tall sits you down on his lap and says, "You will," you go, "Yes, sir, yes, sir." Because his biggest threat was, if you don't do what they say, you won't go home again. I did what they said. This one gets a little bit more involved. The metal cup in the middle was one of the things that they would fill with liquid and have us drink. It was always foul-tasting stuff. You wake up in the morning and you have the normal morning breath. Well, after drinking this stuff, it was a lot worse, believe me. Needles for injecting stuff into us or taking stuff out of our body. One of the things that Beth remembered one morning was an abduction that night, which was very unusual because usually we did not remember abductions right as they happened. We might remember abductions from years ago, or we might not be able to remember when the abductions happened. We just knew that they had happened at some point. But she remembered this one right away, and she remembered both of us being abducted together. And we'd been abducted together for about 40 years at that time. We don't know why they put us together, why they chose us, but we've met other abductees since then that have been put together by the aliens for some unknown reason. But anyway, she remembered us being there and the aliens using one of those needles and putting something into the back of my thigh. And when we woke up the next morning, she talked to me and she says, "Can I see the back of your thigh, please?" And I said, "Well, okay, fine." She didn't tell me why. And in the back of my thigh was a puncture wound with quite a good bruise all the way around it. Don't know what it was for, what happened with it. No idea. This instrument is on flexible tubing. It sometimes is attached to the table. What I remember about this is an abduction that involved my brother when he was very young, and so was I. He was about 3 years old, and I was about 6. And we were out playing in the woods in the wintertime with my cousins, who were a couple girls slightly older than we were. I remember my brother and I being led away by some of the escort service. We went into a spaceship, and I was taken to a medical exam room where I was placed on a table. This instrument was used to slice me from my sternum to my groin. I remember the aliens taking out my internal organs, examining them, looking at them and putting them back. Then they used this same instrument to zip up the incision they'd made in my body. They put a blue gel on top of the incision, and then a light came down from the ceiling, and the light generated heat. I have no scar. I have nothing to show that any of that happened. Then I was taken back to my brother, who was in a waiting room, and they had dressed him again. Unfortunately, they lost one of his boots. And he was sitting there levitating up and down on a chair. He was having fun. I don't know about me. We went back, found my cousins, and we started arguing over who was lost. We told them they were lost. They told us we were lost. When we got home, we were 3 hours late. Our parents gave us heck. And I really got bad news because I was blamed for losing my brother's boot. I think his boot must be in the Alien Museum, where they collect all those things that are left behind. Okay, this is a form-fitting chair. As I said, usually they paralyze us when we try and fight back, when they don't want us to grab hold of them. They seem to be very frail creatures. This is another way of immobilizing us. When we're put in this chair, you see the head clamps. They come along, and this chair actually molds to your body. You can't get out of it. There's no way that we can physically get out of the chair. When they're done with us, the chair actually pops us out into a standing position. Sort of a neat chair. I wish I had one in front of my TV. These are more instruments. The one on top seems strangely human. I mean, my brother has one of these that he uses to pick up his jewels when he's working on his jewels. You know, I have one in the kitchen that I can reach down behind the refrigerator and pick up things that I drop back there. So that one's not very strange. The pulsating light in the middle, Beth saw that one. It's not really a light. It produces a lot of heat. She was placed on a table, and this light came down from the ceiling and scanned her body and actually burned her on one side of her body. She was laid on her side. She expected Doc to come by and take away the pain, but he wasn't there to do that, and we don't know why. At this time also, when the light went away, she thought she was done, and they injected something into her thigh, turned her over, and fried the other side of her body. 2 weeks later, after she got home, she had like a sunburn, and all her skin peeled off. We have no idea why or what was happening. The table down below is quite interesting because it has that little tray that we saw in the earlier slide where different instruments were at hand. The tables and the benches, you've noticed in these drawings, none of them have 4 legs, none of them have 3 legs. They're always a single pedestal table. It doesn't look like they're bolted down, but they don't move. And the tube that's on there, it either sucks stuff out of your body or can also be used to put stuff into your body. These, of course, are the worst parts for me, and that's what I know is happening, and that's the production of alien children, hybrids. You notice these fetuses are removed and put in jars of yellow liquid of some sort, gold colored. Not a pleasant procedure, either being impregnated or having the fetus removed. I have several memories of that, and I don't like being used for this purpose. But as far as I can tell, there are millions of these fetuses being produced. But they're very, very frail. I don't think most of them live very long. The older female you see in this picture was one that looks to me like a hybrid. It was presented to Beth. And the youngster underneath, smaller, Beth was told that was her granddaughter. So they're not content with just the first generation hybrids. They're continuing to experiment after that. This is not an unusual situation, baby presentations. Many times we were brought into areas where there were lots of hybrid children, very skinny, scrawny hybrids. I remember one abduction where there was a little black child, very skinny, had a broken leg. I was told to fix it. I told him I couldn't do that. There was no way I could fix that. And it was the only time I really saw the aliens confused. And it was sort of course you can. You're supposed to fix it. You're supposed to fix this. But it wasn't pleasant being around these children, having to hold these children, nurse these children. We were brought into rooms where there were hundreds of these sometimes. They're not like real children. They don't talk, they squeak. Let's go on to something a little bit more pleasant. The mind gallery. This was one that Beth and I talked about, and as we talked about it, we each remembered little bits and pieces of an abduction when we were children. Beth remembered that we were in a room and that it was something different about the room, and in one area of the room was a mirror. And I was very shocked to figure out we walked straight through the mirror. Now Beth tells me we didn't walk through the mirror, we walked to the side of the mirror and went in. And we went into this area that's called the mind gallery. It's a long tunnel, pretty dark, lit by these blue screens. And on the bottom there are touch panels. When we were very young, we could go into this area and there were pictures on each of the screens, whether they be our parents or mountain scenes or underwater scenes or a book or a refrigerator, who knows what it was. But we could change the picture by pushing the panels underneath. As we got more adept, we could think about what the picture should be as we walked by it, and it would change. So that was sort of neat. I like mind games like that. This was another area that I really liked, and it makes me think that there is some other purpose than just production of hybrid children to the aliens. This is a control panel, and I was taught to pilot the crafts. In the beginning, I was taught to move levers and to memorize constellations. Not any constellation that I can find in any star book here, although that was one of my ways of rebelling. I was told I had to study the sky, I had to study the constellations, and I even went out and bought star charts and star books, but I've refused to read them. I don't want to know that, because if I don't know the star charts and I don't know the constellations, they can't make me pilot the craft. Just a little way of rebelling. But what was really scary about some of this is once I got good at it, that we could fly the small ships by using body English. I didn't have to touch anything. I could just move my body and the ship would go where I wanted it to. With a memorization of the constellations, we'd think of the constellation and the ship would be there. But as we got to pilot larger ships, it took more of us. It took 2 of us or 3 of us. The second person that I flew the ship with was a lady from Australia. I don't know her name. But the third person, when we were flying the largest of the ships, ended up being Beth's son, who still to this day says he is not an abductee, doesn't want to be an abductee, and so has been able to live his life without those added memories. And unfortunately, Beth's granddaughter, at the age of 4, started drawing pictures of her friend, New, who was gray, had no clothes on, had large gray eyes, and would take her on interesting vacations and trips. But he threatened not to bring her home again unless she cooperated. This was another of Beth's memories. As you see, there's the form-fitting chair, and she was forced to look at these foals. And I do raise horses. We were raising a lot of foals then. And one of the things the aliens told Beth was that foals have changed. And sure enough, if you look at the feet of these foals, they don't have hooves anymore. They have very soft pads. We don't know what the guy over here was doing. Doing some sort of manipulation. But in this whole foal thing, one of the things that I was told was that, and shown, is that the aliens have a zoo up there. And it is the most comprehensive zoo of the Earth. Because there's going to be massive Earth changes. One of the things they have told me is going to happen is that a comet or an asteroid would hit the Earth, destroy 99% of life on Earth. And what they were doing was collecting all the genetic material and all the biomes and all the minerals and all the soil organisms and everything else on Earth so they could replace it once the asteroid damage had gone. I don't think I believe that either. But that, in brief, is our story, my story. You know, there's parts of it I really like. I think it's really neat to be able to float through windows. Sometimes I think it's really neat to steer the ships. I've learned an awful lot about different civilizations, different ways of looking at things. I met some really neat people, but I really hate the intrusions. I hate being abducted, taken against my will. I hate the medical procedures. But now I have a little bit of distance from it. I haven't seen them in about 2 years, which means they're not abducting me anymore. Or I put up my wall again, and I just don't remember it. I don't care which it is. I'm happier this way. I have gotten on with my life. Thank you for listening.